Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Thursday, May 13th, 2021. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the House Lounge at the Rhode Island State House. And today's agenda is our main focus is on the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. We haven't been in touch for so long. We'd like a number of updates to include an update on caseload numbers and number of calls to the child abuse hotline during the pandemic. We suspect that there were many changes. An update on the hiring process for a new permanent director, an update on the process to seek Human and Social Services accreditation from the Council of Accreditation, an update on the settlement agreement in the case of Andrew C. versus Raimondo, and an update on efforts to recruit and retain frontline workers to fill all available FTEs. So, Zaire, would you take roll call, please?
Absolutely. Chairwoman Serpa.
Present.
Rep. Casemiro.
Present.
Rep. Norray.
Here.
Representative Agello. Okay. Representative Baptista. Yeah. Rep. Carson. Whip Chippendale.
Present.
Rep. Courtfriend. Okay. Rep. Donovan.
Present.
Rep. Edwards. Rep. Falella.
Here.
Rep. Handy. Rep. Hawkins. Rep. Knight.
Here.
Rep. Lima. Rep. Messier.
Here.
Rep. Newberry. Rep. Place.
Present.
Rep. Slater. Rep. Solomon. Rep. Speakman.
Present.
Chairwoman Williams.
Present.
Thank you, Zaire. Just as a little preview, at some point during the meeting, I'm going to get a text to go down to Finance to introduce a bill that I have there. I expect that I'll be there very briefly, then I'll be back. When I do have to leave, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Vice Chair Julie Casemiro. And I think we should note that Rep. Agello was present. Thank you. Okay, Director Aucoin, welcome. We haven't seen you in such a long time, and I hope you have some at least good news for us. And I understand that you'd like to begin. We have a handout dated Thursday, May 13th, 2021. So, Director, I will let you proceed. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Chairwoman Serpa. Good afternoon, Chairwoman Serpa and members of the committee, and thanks for the opportunity to allow us to speak today and provide you some critical updates regarding the work here at DCYF. It has been a while, and I think these are very timely updates that we have for you. We've addressed our updates with regard to the items you've mentioned, so we will go through a PowerPoint addressing each one of those items. I want to take a moment and introduce the Department Administrative team that I have on the call with me today. Our Executive Counsel for DCYF, Patricia Hessler, our Assistant Data of Evaluation and Chief Epidemiologist, Colleen Carone, our Assistant Director of Family Services, Winsome Stone, our Assistant Director of Child Protective Services, Stephanie Terry, our Chief of Licensing Regulation, Veronica Davis, and our Legislative Director and Legislative Liaison, Adam Williams. I and our team will be available to answer questions after our presentation. Just a brief opening comment before I get to the slides. As you're aware, the Department's mission is to partner with families and communities to raise safe and healthy children and youth in a caring environment. To be successful in this work, DCYF has shifted its practice to be able to better promote child and family well-being. This means investing in timely support for at-risk children and families so that they get the help they need when they need it. This also means making more prevention investment upstream to reach families before they are in crisis. The department continues to shift its practices grounded in family engagement. We are also utilizing a race equity lens to view all of our work. We are committed to collaborating with communities and stakeholders to address the needs specific to the children and families that we serve. As I mentioned, the committee has asked for several updates. The first update is in regard to the status of the search for a new director. First, I want to assure you, Governor McKee looks at filling the position of DCF director as a priority. He will be retaining a search firm to seek out qualified candidates for the DCYF director position, which has been open for almost 2 years. At this point, I'm going to proceed with a PowerPoint presentation to address the items that you asked us to address in the order that are referenced in the agenda. Mr. Williams will help facilitate the PowerPoint that we'll go through. The first item you asked us to look at was the status of DCYF caseloads. So every month we publish a strategic dashboard, and in this strategic dashboard we have a caseload count for our family service units. Our family service units are, in essence, the units that provide case management services for children and families that are open to DCYF by virtue of a child maltreatment case. What you see here are two lines. One is red. That line reflects the average caseload assignments for social caseworkers who have 14 or more families. The second line in blue relates to the average caseloads for social workers with 10 or more families. As you can see, and this has certainly been a historical trend, that the caseloads at DCYF fluctuate. In this instance, you can see how the caseload started in March of 2020 at 16.5 and actually increased to 17.6 by the time we're in November and December 20. And you can also see what happened as we go into 2021. At present, based on our May 1 report, the average caseloads in FSU for caseworkers with 14 or more families is 15.9 families, and for caseworkers with 10 or more families is 14.8. One key fact that I would mention here is we attribute the decline in the caseloads to our efforts that occurred during the spring of 2020 when DCYF worked in coordination with the Department of Administration in putting together and administering a civil service exam for social caseworkers. As a result of that effort, and keep in mind that effort occurred during the height of the pandemic, as a result of that effort, we were able to establish a civil service list and began to fill vacancies in social work positions in family services, first in August of 2020, and then in December of 2020. We had a third class begin in April of 2021. What you will see later on in this slide presentation, that as a result of those hires and the retention of staff and the improved retention of staff in family services, we have seen a dramatic downward trend in terms of caseload averages for our family service units. Adam, if we can go to the next, thank you. The next issue you asked us about is the reports to the Child Abuse Hotline, Child Protective Services. So, as has been widely reported, and certainly consistent with many other states, both in the region and nationally, during the pandemic, we experienced a significant decline in the number of reports to the Child Abuse Hotline. The best way to read this report, the two critical factors in this report, are the numbers in the gray box and the numbers in the blue. So in the gray box, it'll tell you as of January 2020, we had an average of 64.8 calls to the hotline a day. You will see what happened to that average as we get into March, April, and May. And it was a significant drop, almost 40% drop in calls. You can also see that when we get to December, January, February, and beyond, there has now been a trend upward in terms of the reports to the child abuse hotline. Certainly that is consistent with, first, the restrictions that were put in place back in March, April, and May with regard to schools, with regard to community activities, all relating to COVID prevention. You can also see the impact of, as we emerge from the pandemic, what has happened as schools reopen and as our children and youth return to the classroom, and that the community restrictions are being eased. In our world, this is good news that children are back out in the community, are back in school, have people able to see them, talk to them, and address their needs. You might ask, what did the department do during that period of time from March until December of 2020 in response to this drop? And again, this was not something that was unique to Rhode Island. It was happening everywhere. What we did was our child protection team, and with Stephanie Terry's leadership, reached out to several of our large school departments and met with them to discuss the availability of support services to at-risk children, youth, and families. We wanted them to make sure that as they were doing the distant learning, as they saw children, youth, and families struggling, we wanted to give them the opportunity to be able to access support services for those children, at-risk children, youth, and families. At the same time, in September of 2020, under the leadership of our Assistant Director of Family Services, Winsome Stone, we created a unit called a Support and Response Unit within Family Services. It's not a child maltreatment unit. It is a family support unit. So we established a toll-free number, a 188 number, that families could call to access services, access support voluntarily. It was not that they were calling on themselves at a child abuse hotline. They were calling to get help. To date, from September, the last week of September to now, we have served over 700 families through that support and response unit. Clearly, that unit is here to stay, and that is part of our prevention plan as we move services to at-risk families and children upstream. As we emerge from the pandemic and we see the reports of the child abuse hotline increase, we are prepared to address that in terms of meeting that increased demand. So Governor McKee's budget actually includes 4 additional FTEs for child protective investigators in the FY22 budget. We have been successful in being able to maintain our caseloads to date through the management of cases within the unit, and we feel that the addition of 4 additional child protective investigators will help us as we prepare for the increase in the number of cases that we expect to see to the child abuse hotline. The next slide deals with the Council on Accreditation. So as this committee is very well aware, I think it was in 2019 that the General Assembly enacted an amendment to a law that required DCYF to submit an accreditation plan to the General Assembly and the Governor no later than October 1 of 2020. As part of that plan, the department provided a roadmap as to what it would take for DCYF to achieve Council on Accreditation. It is important that you note that, first of all, we met the requirement of the law by submitting the plan to the General Assembly, and we made it clear in the plan that the ability to implement that plan was contingent on the availability of budget appropriation. There are a couple of major takeaways from what we submitted in that plan on the Council on Accreditation. The first, on a positive note, and all this is positive in my world, on a positive note, the department's current practice model aligns very well with the COA standards. And that relates to having the critical tools and assessments necessary to carry out our functions. In particular, the assessments that we use for structured decision-making in determining what cases merit a child protector investigation, our safety assessments through family engagement forms that we implemented in 2019 as a standardized document that our staff utilize to assess safety and create safety plans, and our level of need forms that is a standardized instrument that provides a assessment of level of need of every child upon entry into DCYF care. As we were looking at this back in August, September, actually during the summer, in August and September 2020, we were looking at it at the time based on our current staffing and our caseloads. Based on that determination and based on the Council on Accreditation standards, the department approximated it would need an additional 90 staff and an estimated $10.8 million all funds once we were fully accredited, and that's key, once we were fully accredited. We also asked and indicated that we would need a accreditation unit, an internal accreditation unit at DCYF to, number one, manage the accreditation process, and number two, ensure that the agency could sustain accreditation going forward. We submitted a recommendation that we would implement this given the scope and the enormity of this, and quite frankly, the fiscal consequence of this. We recommended that the state consider a 4-year implementation timeline. The other areas that we just need to take into consideration is that if we go down this path, okay, at some point in 2, 3, 4 years, we're going to need to address office space requirements, technological requirements, and some statutory regulatory changes as well as collective bargaining issues. One issue that we were concerned about is a requirement that all frontline supervisors at DCYF would require an advanced degree. As of the time we were drafting this report in August and September of 2020, 36 of our 60 frontline supervisors did not have an advanced degree. While we certainly can appreciate the value of having frontline supervisors have an advanced degree, we are concerned about the impact not only on existing staff, but the impact going forward in terms of upward mobility for existing staff within the agency. Those are just areas of consideration that the state needs to look at before making its decision. In making a final decision, we need to decide, the state is going to need to decide whether it is willing to invest both in finances and resources going forward, okay, to meet this accreditation standard. As I would just mention that in our report, one of the exhibits in the report, it talked about and identified all the county administered systems and the state administered systems that are accredited by the COA. There's not many statewide systems, state administered systems that are accredited. In New England, there are no other New England states that are currently accredited by the COA. The principal reason in talking to my colleagues in the other states is the financial commitment. So it's a real consideration. If asked, I know I'll be asked, is would Council on Accreditation improve our outcomes for children and families? Okay, I would say without doubt it would. Okay, it certainly would. But we need to assess its cost. We need to assess its financial impact. The next section I want to talk about is children's rights. So the Children's Rights Settlement Agreement started in 2007. It was filed, I think, about 2 or 3 child advocates ago by the existing then child advocate on U.S. District Court. After it was filed, Children's Rights entered into the lawsuit and has been a persistent party since. After 2007, after an extended mediation period.
Director, could I just interrupt you right there for 1 second, please?
Sure.
Before you go into any details about the children's rights settlement, could you just give like a 20-word synopsis of what that case was about? Because we have a number of new members on the committee and we have a couple of freshmen, so I'd just like them to be brought up to date as to, what happened in the past, just very briefly, if you don't mind. I didn't mean to, okay, thank you.
No, that's not a problem. Very, very good point. So the lawsuit as initiated through the Child Advocate and ultimately Children's Rights challenged a number of practices within DCYF with regard to its policies, its practices regarding child maltreatment, the services it provides to children that are in out-of-home care, its permanency planning process, its ability to provide case plans. It looked at the entire child welfare system and challenged the department's record of meeting the needs of the children in its child welfare caseload. It certainly closed in on and looked at caseloads. It looked at how the agency was effectuating permanency, and it measured it up against the guidelines that the federal government has set for child welfare agencies. This was not a unique lawsuit. Children's Rights has gone in a number of states, filed a number of actions in a number of states that have resulted in many consent agreements. The state of Connecticut is currently under a settlement agreement that they've been under for 30 years. New Hampshire has had a recent filing under Children's Rights. So they go around and they're basically asking, trying to hold states accountable to meet the measures that it's required to meet under the child welfare regulations, the federal government's child welfare regulations. So it's a very broad overview, Madam Chair. I'm not sure if is that enough to go into this, or do you want a little more?
I think that's fine unless some of the new members have a question before we proceed any further, because I don't want them to, everybody.
Understood.
Okay.
And as I go through this, it may help further explain portions of, because as we get the settlement agreement and we get into individual sections, you'll see exactly what sections were targeted for improvement in terms of performance.
Representative Batista, you didn't raise your hand as a question, or you would just, did you? You do have a, oh, okay, all right, okay. Go ahead, Director, I'm sorry.
All right, thank you, I'm sorry. So this initiated, we had a settlement in May of 2018, and it's important to understand that this was a negotiated settlement between Children's Rights, DCYF, and we used actually a mediator in the U.S. District Court to get this done. The agreement focuses on areas where DCF must continue to improve performance with regard to child protective services, recruitment of foster homes, social work division in terms of case plan development, permanency planning, visitation, as well as our child protective unit. Within the framework of the settlement agreement, which will be important as we go into this, it provides a matrix that the department is required to meet and sets benchmarks that the department must meet. They're called commitments. And as we meet the benchmarks, there's a data validator that he gets data that's broken down into 6-month reporting periods. We have to report out to the data validator every 6 months on these metrics. He analyzes the data. He then validates whether or not the department has met the metrics in that 6-month period and submits his information to the Office of the Child Advocate. The data validator and the Office of the Child Advocate make up the monitoring team for this settlement agreement. So after the data validator submits his work to the Child Advocate's role is to review and approve, or not approve, the results of the data validator. If if the department were to meet the requirements of that, the commitment and the matrix in the 6-month reporting period, we then trigger into the next 6 months. Okay, we go through that in 6-month cycles. If the department is able to satisfy the requirements in the 6-month reporting cycles for 2 consecutive 6-month reporting cycles, the commitment in that section of the settlement agreement can exit out of the settlement agreement by agreement of the parties. So you'll see how that works in a little bit. If the department does not meet the metrics with regard to the sections of the settlement agreement for 2 consecutive months, the department is required to prepare a corrective action plan to address the shortfalls of not being able to meet the requirements of the settlement agreement. So if we could go into the next, all right, so these are your reporting periods to date. So we are currently in reporting period 6, January 1, 21 to June 30th of 21. We have 4 reports that we have received from the monitoring team to date. You can see them outlined to the right. And the first reporting period, which was July of 18 to December of 18, the first report we received was June 30th of 19, and that report was subsequently updated in December of 2019, and again in February 9th of 2021. And I'm not going to read this, it's pretty self-explanatory. What's important when we get to the following slide is the reporting period 3, December 3 of 2020, when we received that report, it actually triggered, reporting period 2 and 3, triggered some corrective action items that the department needed to act on with regard to those items that we were not able to successfully achieve in terms of the settlement agreement. We could go to the next slide. So on the positive end, based on the reports to date, okay, the department has been successful in achieving the requirements in sections 2 and 3, okay, and those relate to processes that the department put in place to assess proper utilization of placement of youth and children in assessment stabilization centers, and also proper process to approve the placement of children in congregate care. You can see that the performance matrix that we are required to achieve is in the left column that has 85%, 100%, 90, 90, 90, 90. And the actual results of the reporting periods are reflected in reporting period 1, 2, 3, and 4. Based on the results in reporting periods 1 and 2, the parties agreed and the monitoring team approved that the state had successfully met its requirements for sections 2 and 3. In terms of section 9, it doesn't have a data metrics next to it. Section 9 required the department to promulgate policy to ensure that there would be an ongoing review of the appropriateness of foster care maintenance payments. The department promulgated that policy back in 2019, and as part of the exit stipulation that was filed in federal court in March of 2021, the parties agreed to allow the state to discharge and exit out of sections 2, 3, and 9, and that was signed by U.S. District Court Judge Smith on March 26, 2021.
Director, can I interrupt you right there because maybe it's just me, but I'm a little confused. Okay, so you said on page 5, right, that there are categories. In order to settle this case, there are categories that DCYF must comply with because they must measure up to federal standards, right?
Correct.
Okay, so on page 8, I count 15 sections, 15 measures. So are those the 15 measures with which DCYF must comply before we can be, forgiven of the transgression in that area?
Right, so
Go ahead.
Yes, when we get to, if we could go to slide 8, so these are the items that we were successfully completed on slide 7. Slide 8 relates to the other items that are part of the performance metrics in the settlement agreement, and you'll see the same setup. Compliance, those are the metrics that we have committed to meeting to successfully achieve compliance with sections 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10. And you can see our performance to date. We highlighted in green those sections that we have achieved compliance in one reporting period, some in multiple reporting periods. However, it's important to note that in order to successfully exit out of the section 6, we need to be able to achieve compliance in all of those items, 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, I'm sorry, 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, and 6.4b. So even if we achieve compliance with one of, let's say 6.1, we can't discharge out of section 6 until we've achieved all the requirements in those areas, and we achieve compliance in section 10 regarding case plans.
Okay, so in reporting period 4, we were compliant in section 6.1, caseworker visits frequency. We were compliant 96.14% of the time. Yes?
Correct.
Okay. And in section 8.1 CPS report screen in, we were compliant almost 94% of the time, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So the very first column labeled compliance after the measure, are those the required compliance measures, or are they our aspirational compliance measures? That I think.
They're probably both, Madam Chair. They are our required performance metrics. Those are what we must meet in order to satisfy the requirement of that section.
So, in section 4.1, DCYF must be compliant at least 80% of the time at the end of reporting period 1. Yes?
That's correct. We need to, in order to exit out though, we need to hit that mark in 2 consecutive reporting periods.
Okay, so just taking that very first one. So we were not compliant after the first reporting period, and in fact, we did a little worse in reporting period 2, 3, and 4, for the sake of these tables. Am I interpreting this correctly?
You are interpreting that correctly.
Okay, because I was a little confused, and I just want to make sure before we go forward if I was interpreting it correctly. Okay, I think I'm settled now.
All right, if we could go back to 7, because I will get to this slide.
Okay.
On 7, you'll notice with that analysis, that helps, Madam Chair.
Okay.
On section 1, you'll see that the requirement standard is 85%. You will see that the department has so far, based on the data validators reports, met that metrics, at least on the data piece. We do have a dispute as to whether or not the state has satisfied the metrics, and we are currently in mediation to see if we could resolve that dispute. So 1 has not been satisfied yet, as we have to work through that in terms of ongoing discussions. The other
Okay,
two elements...
so stop again, please. So why has 1.0 not been satisfied yet when the federal compliance standard is 85%, right?
Correct.
Okay, so we did 89.13, 89.08, 91.24, and 91.40. So in my mathematical mind, we're doing better than the federal standard compliance, no?
Yes, and I really want to be respectful to the legal process. The department's position is we have satisfied the requirements. We have a dispute on that, and we are trying to work through that dispute to see if we can voluntarily reach a agreed upon disposition through mediation. Our position is we have met those requirements based on what you just said, Madam Chair, that we have met performance metrics.
So
there
that's...
are other items that we need to talk through amongst the parties, And I'm confident that through the mediation process, we'll see through that, and we will hopefully be able to achieve a successful outcome on Section 1.
So those are the percentages of compliance that we assign ourselves?
No, let's say the compliance, 85, 100, 90, 95, 90, 90, that was the result of a year and a half of mediation between DCYF and the children's rights. There was a lot of back and forth in terms of what would be the appropriate metrics, what would be the appropriate compliance. We did not unilaterally set those parameters. Those were agreed upon parameters between DCYF and children's rights.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay, go ahead.
All right, the other 2 points on this slide, I'll move on because I want to get to the slide you were at, on slide 8. There are 2 other elements in the settlement agreement. They don't have a matrix on them, but they require ongoing compliance as long as settlement agreement's in place. We're required to issue an annual maltreatment report, and we've done that in 2019, 20, and 21. And we're also required to submit a foster care recruitment plan. We have submitted a plan in 2019 and 20. In 2021, we are engaged in very productive discussions with the Office of the Child Advocate, as well as the data validator, and we expect that the recruitment plan, the foster care recruitment plan, will be finalized by the end of this month. But those are well underway, and sections 11 and 12, we're required to do those plans, and they will be posted on our website once we reach agreement. Now, going to the slide we just spent a little bit of time on. So on this, very clearly, we have much more work to do, and you correctly identified the sibling visits. That's with sibling placements. We have seen actually some improvement in that based on preliminary data in reporting period 5, but it's not final yet. It certainly is consistent with our practice of increasing our use of kinship homes, relative homes. Our goal is to keep kin together, and quite frankly, we expect that we will achieve compliance with sibling placements over the upcoming reporting periods. There are the provisions in Section 6 are definitely tied to the provisions in Section 10 as it relates to face-to-face visits, as it relates to meaning caseworkers' visits with children in their caseload, as well as visitation between parents and children and sibling visits. And then we have case plan timeliness and case plan accuracy. We have created, and Ms. Stone will be here this afternoon to answer your questions, we have created a corrective action plan to increase compliance with regard to those items. As it relates to our Child Protective Division, that's in sections 8, 8.1, 8.2, and 8.3. And you can see that we've improved performance in our Child Protective Provision, our Child Protective Service, but we still have some work to do. And Stephanie can outline the steps she has taken in her corrective action plan to address the areas that are still lagging, and we are confident that those areas will reach the performance metrics that's required in the next 2 reporting periods. The last one is on our Resource Family Division, and Veronica Davis is here tonight to talk about the Resource Family and the effort she's made and her staff have made. This is an area that we're paying attention to all of them, but this one in particular, we're paying very close attention. We have really dedicated, our staff have really dedicated their efforts to recruitment of families over the last year and a half, to the point where, as we sit here today, they've actually recruited over 150 new foster homes since July of 2000 and I want to make sure I get the years right, 2020. And that's incredible because our goal for the entire fiscal year of 21 was 100. So we've already exceeded that goal and actually exceeded it plus 50. We're well on our way there. However, we have certain issues, and most of the issues in resource families, as is some of the others, relates to documentation. So we have put into place some corrective action plans to ensure that we're getting credit for the action steps that our staff are doing, so that we can ensure that good practice is also being recognized under the terms of this data validation process. But as I said, we have more work to go, and we want to be able to satisfy all of these measures in the very near future. One item I need to talk about is related to what happens with regard to doing a workload study. Because under Section 5 of the settlement agreement, when we are unable to satisfy the provisions of Section 6 and Section 10, we are required to facilitate a workload study for our family service units. That requirement was triggered when we got the monitoring team's third report that clearly documented that the state was not meeting its requirements with regard to the case management practices in Section 6 and 10. As a result of that, we put together a team to work and consult first with Casey Family Programs and with some sister states. We spoke to our colleagues in New England. We were fortunate to have actually one state in New England, Maine, who actually underwent a workload study for their agency in 2019 and 20. So we were able to obtain the workload study itself, the documents they use for procurement, the scope of work. We've created our own scope of work. We've shared that with the monitoring team, and a meeting is scheduled for next week to go over that with the monitoring team. We've also reached out to the Division of Purchasing to explore what the procurement options will be for the state so we can move this project along rather quickly. So we are hopeful that by sometime in June or July, we're at a point where we have a vendor, we can get a contract, and get the workload study underway in FY22. Next one, Adam. All right. So I'm going through all of the items, and certainly we can answer questions at the end. So the next item you asked about was staffing. This I know has had a lot of attention, and rightfully so. And we're glad it has attention. So under the FY21 budget, there's some numbers that are absolutely important that we nail down. Under the FY21 budget, there's an FTE, full-time equivalent cap, of 617.5. As a result of our most recent payroll on April 30th, we had 600 individuals on our employment roll. On the April 30th payroll, 586 of those staff received a paycheck. That left 14 staff on long-term leave. Long-term leave could be extended workers' comp, could be extended family medical leave, could be long-term sick leave. But they've exhausted their sick time, they've exhausted the workers' comp time, and they remain on leave, but they're not getting paid. So that's the differential between the 600 and the 586. The other important number to realize is that in FY21, it was a very difficult budget year, and you all remember the term that at the end, there was a skinny budget passed for the FY21 budget, and in the skinny budget, the state in our department was allowed to be made whole. We didn't lose anything, but one of the things, which was good, but one of the things that happened was there was an increase in our turnover savings. So in the FY21 budget, there was a turnover savings set at $2.3 million. That is, when you equate that, that's the equivalent of about 20 positions. So in essence, it dropped down our budgeted positions from 617 to 597. So that's what this chart reflects. So on April 30th, we had 600 names on our employment roster. We had 586 receiving a check. Next slide. In terms of our staffing, we just wanted to put in perspective the percentages of staff within DCYF. So we outlined all 600 staff for DCYF. We broke it down into 3 categories: frontline staff, operational support and clerical, and administrative. For purposes of this chart, it's important to know that our frontline staff included child protective investigators, social workers, frontline supervisors, probation officers, direct care personnel at the training school, child support technicians, along with other staff personnel who have direct contact with children, youth, and families on a routine basis. Based on that, in our breakdown, we have 74% of our staff classified as frontline staff. So what I wanted to show in this slide is it definitely reinforces the priority the department is given to filling frontline vacant positions at DCYF, not just in the last 12 months, 18 months. That has really the priority that's been given to filling frontline vacancy positions over the last 2 to 3 years. And then you'll see the breakdown of the expenditures on the right side. Next slide. The other issue is vacancies. So I'm not going to go back to the other slide, but you'll recall that I said we had 617.5 and we had 600 names on our personnel roster as of April 30th. That left, in essence, 18 vacancies. So we identified the 18 vacancies, and you'll note that of those 18 vacancies, 6 are social workers, 2 are investigators, and 1 supervisor. We put in red on this slide to indicate that the department is in the process of filling these vacant positions, 14 of these 18 vacant positions, and we would expect, as I mentioned before, we expect to have the social workers, the casework supervisor, and the child protector investigators on board by the 2nd week of July. Once again, our premise is to fill frontline vacant positions. I should also note, while we're on this slide, that as part of Governor McKee's FY22 budget, that we certainly are hoping that we get support for, there is a request for additional FTEs for DCYF. One of those additional, and I already mentioned one, which was the 4 child protective investigators. Another key one in that budget ask is 12 caseworkers supervisor vacancies that will go to fill staffing in family services. So we are hoping to get the funding for those extra FTEs, which will reinforce the ongoing trend of reducing caseloads in family services. So not only are we filling every vacancy in family service and child protection that we can, we are also advocating that we get additional staffing resources in the FY22 budget to be able to continue increasing the number of social workers on the front line. With that, I know I've gone on for a while. I appreciate your retention. I knew there was one more. All right, we were asked about retention, and I'm really glad that we did this. So we went back and we looked at retention rates from 17 to 20. And you'll see we broke it down by social workers and by investigators. You can see what our retention rates were in 17 and 18 for those 2 positions. So we looked at the people hired in 17, 18, and we looked at whether or not they remained in their position for 12 months and 24 months. We had retention rates back in 17 and 18 of under 50% with regard to social workers. We actually had pretty decent retention rates for investigators at that time. In 19 and 20, there was a dramatic improvement in terms of retention rates for social workers. And I would tell you that also in 21, because we hired another class in January of 21, March of 21, those staff remain in place. It's far too early, though, to call that a victory, but they remain in place. So the bottom line is, we attribute that this improvement in the rate of retention for both investigators and social workers is based on the efforts of our HR administrator, who's not here tonight, Colleen Walters, Pat Hessler, working with the staff over at the Department of Administration and Personnel Classification, in looking at the requirements for the social work position, and looking at the examination process, and in better screening and interviewing of the candidates who are seeking to sit for the exam. We've also had the opportunity under the leadership of Kevin McKenna to implement a new training module and provide more increased support for staff when they start. They're not just thrown into a caseload. In fact, it's a very gradual process, which I think has served us well based on the data you have in front of you. So with that, I think that is my final slide. I just want in closing to thank you for your patience. I know I went on for a while. There was a lot to cover. I really liked the agenda that you set for us. And both myself and the DCF administrative team stand ready, willing, and able to answer any questions you may have. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Director. Chairwoman Serpa had to leave because she has a bill being heard in finance, but she'll be back. I know I have a lot of questions. I'm sure other people in this room have questions. So I'll let you defer to who's going to answer them, but I'd like to start on page 2 if I could. The average caseload numbers. Who figures out these numbers, and how do staff on probation figure into these numbers?
All right, staff on, you're talking about probation in terms of new staff?
Yes, yes.
All right, I'll start and I'll toss it over to Colleen Caron in terms of how this is calculated, because this goes out of our Division of Performance Improvement. But let me start. So the reason why we do this matrix, and Adam, if you could put up on the PowerPoint, it would help. The reason why we do this matrix by breaking it down in caseworkers with over 14 families and caseworkers with over 10 families is to ensure that we're not skewing the results. So if a new worker comes in, they may get their first case or two in the first 2 to 3 months, or maybe 3 or 4. But their caseload is not going to be factored into that blue line, because they don't have more than 10 cases. If we started including all caseworkers that have 1, 2, all the way up to 9 cases, these numbers would be lower, but I don't think they paint an accurate picture of the caseloads of the seasoned staff, the non-probationary staff, who are carrying what we would call a full caseload. So that's how we break that down. Colleen Caron, do you want to add anything to that?
No, Kevin, you explained it well, and this is just the caseload for the Family Service Unit.
Correct.
So these numbers are just abuse and neglect cases. Where do we find information on voluntary extension of care numbers and the children's behavioral health numbers?
Well, the voluntary extension of care numbers, I actually got data this afternoon. I could tell you currently we have 102 cases open to the voluntary extension of care unit. And we currently, I believe, have 4 or 5 caseworkers assigned to the voluntary extension of care unit. I don't have the breakdown of the caseload, but it's over 20 youth. They're not carrying families, though. That's a key distinction. Mm-hmm. They're not carrying families. They're carrying the young adults.
But they're still carrying caseloads of, on average, 20 cases.
Right, of young adults. That is correct. And in terms of the children's behavioral health, I don't have that data with me. They really don't. They have some caseload in children's services and behavioral health, but not many. So we could get you that data.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions on the Children's Rights Settlement Agreement. You said on page 5 that the settlement took effect in May of 2018, but it seems like we're still doing a lot of work on this. How much money does this costing the state on an annual basis?
Well, right now the payment, certainly there was an outlay of legal fees at the time the case was settled based on the legal work that had been done by Children's Rights between 2007 and 2018. Outside of the legal fees, the payment per year is based on the work that is being done by the data validator. We can get you the amount of money that we are paying to the data validator for his firm's work in terms of analyzing our data and then providing the report over to the child advocate's office.
So we are paying an outside consultant for that? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, what happens when we achieve all of our benchmark numbers? Are you still going to continue to track these metrics?
We track, a lot of these metrics, Representative, a lot of the metrics we will track because we're required to track under the federal requirements. So like our face-to-face contacts, we certainly will track that. We're required to. We're required to have 95% face-to-face contact with children in our open to DCYF and out-of-home care. So we will continue to track that. A number of these we absolutely will. And I think it would be great that if we can achieve, when we achieve compliance, not if, when we achieve compliance, that we're able to continue to track that we are continuing to perform to the standard. This was the standard that the state of Rhode Island and Children's Rights agreed to, which would represent good child casework practice for child welfare cases. So I think it would be a great practice to be able to continue to maintain that performance.
Okay, on page 7, section 3.1, in June of 2019, we had a 100% compliance rate, and then in December of 2019, it plummeted to 65.88%. Can you tell me what happened there?
Yes. Actually, and that's an area that got dismissed from the lawsuit. At that point, there had been a change, an organizational change within the agency. We moved to a system where we had chief of practice standards that were assigned to oversee 4 regions. And I think that there was a drop in terms of the responsibility in terms of picking this up. So that was addressed by our Assistant Director, Winston Stone, and made sure that the chief of practice standards understood their requirements with regard to making those determinations, and that was rectified.
Thank you. And my last question is on page 10, where we often hear that DCYF is top-heavy, and it looks like we spend just over $7 million on administrators. How many administrators do we have?
We can get you that. We provided I think at the last subcommittee hearing, we provided an organizational chart. So we're showing that 7% of our staff, we would classify as administrators at 7% of 600. I'm not going to be able to do that math quickly in my head.
That works. That answer works for me.
All right. And that's reflected on that chart. Adam, can you help on that?
Yes, so there are about 40, you can just, I think it's 7% of 600, so I think, so it would be 7% of 586. So I think that's right about 40 administrators. It's all based on the 586 who are listed on our payroll, so you can just 7% of that or 19% for the support workers, but the denominator is 586, Madam Chairman.
Okay.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you. And that was my last question. I'm going to open it up to questions from other committee members. Does anybody in the room or on the Zoom call from the committee have any questions?
I do certainly, Chairwoman.
Go for
Chippendale
it.
Here.
Go for it.
Thank you for recognizing me. Kevin, thank you for your presentation today. And I've been told I don't do this enough, so I'd like to get this out of the way. I want to thank you for your service. You have always been the type of person who steps up whenever there's been a need. Your years and decades of dedicated service to the state of Rhode Island does not go unnoticed. So I'd like to temper my statements with that qualifier. To you and to everyone who works with you. I believe that you all are trying to do the best you can in the positions you are, and that you're trying to get to the same place we want you to get to. That being said, there's the big but, right? So that being said, we have some serious issues within the department that have lingered on for years and years. And certainly the federal lawsuit, as well as the accreditation conversation that started a couple of years ago, has brought to the surface many of those issues. I feel like I'm at the point where we have, and not just with you, but with your predecessors as well, where we have gone round and round and round about many of the particulars, and we're not really making any headway towards achieving a lot of the goals that are necessary. And when I say that, I'm talking about accreditation in particular. We know now that we're looking at about an $11 million price tag to get us to the point where we need to be. And that's pretty hefty. You know, we look at the entire budget for employees, which was, I think, around 76.6 million. And we are still woefully inadequate in the number of frontline workers that we have. So that's not on you. That's on us as the legislature, and that is on the several former administrations who have failed repeatedly every year to properly fund and provide resources to your department. That is something you can't do anything about. And I again want to thank you for doing as much as you have and for performing as well as you have under those circumstances. However, between the federal lawsuit where we keep coming short, I think in my estimation, we hit about 4 of the 15 benchmarks. And that's indicative of, again, the lack of support you have in resources from the legislature and the administration. However, we have to, I think, we have to come to the point where we either say we will forego accreditation or we will invest in accreditation. And again, that is not on you. This is more of a broadcast statement to all of my colleagues in government. But we have to either put this aside and forget about it, or we have to go forward and do it. So as I look at the budget requests, the budget proposals, and then the budget approvals, we keep cutting your staff. That is never going to get us to where we need to be. Ever, because we know from the first analysis we're about 80 to 90 FTEs short of where we need to be. So without that support, you're not getting there. I don't know, frankly, what you can do to solve that. But if you had one genie in the bottle magic wish, what would it be to help you get to that point?
That's a question I probably never been asked. I got to say that the one ideal wish is that we all work together and work to achieving a common goal. There's been a lot of progress that has been made. The staff here at DCYF are beyond belief dedicated and committed to working with families. We're seeing, I think, I would just want to say one thing, Representative Dale, and I appreciate your comments, both personally and also I think I take those comments for all of DCYF, so I appreciate that. But the one thing is, we need everyone's support, and we have made a lot of progress, and albeit we're coming out of a pandemic, but we're coming out of a pandemic with caseloads trending in the right direction. We have some budget proposals that will increase the utilization of more casework staffs next year. If we got 2 additional units and we're starting at 15.9 caseloads for people with full caseloads in FSU, I would expect those caseloads will drop under 15. I've been in 38 years. We have never, ever had an average caseload of under 15 families per caseworker in FSU. So we're in the right direction. I think we need to take this in steps. We're not going to get the genie in the bottle to just wake up and say, let's give everything out there. But I think with 12 additional FSU staff next year, we have a workload study that'll be coming out. I'd like to get the workload study and see what those recommendations are and build those into our FY23 budget proposal. That would be my genie in the bottle to, quite frankly, be able to sustain the improvements we made, build on the improvements we made, and then sustain them. But do it in a way that it's based on, credible evaluation and analysis done by a reputable entity. And I think this workload study is going to give us that.
Thank you very much for that. And just as a quick follow-up, I do want to say that the folks that are at DCYF right now are so dedicated to what they do, because frankly, under the current circumstances, a person who just wants to show up and collect a paycheck, this ain't the job for them, right? So the folks you have are so dedicated. My concern in speaking with these folks, which I do quite often, is that they're burning out. And I know that you know that. I know that my colleagues on this committee know that as well. But we will get to a point of sort of terminal velocity where we lose too many people, and that's my greatest concern. There are the educational requirements, which you touched on, which I believe are certainly a little bit out of our reach at this time. We have to take care of the groceries. The groceries are making sure that we don't lose those folks who are so dedicated. And I mean, these are folks who at midnight are wondering, is this person in the right place? Did this child get the follow-up, et cetera, et cetera? They can't sleep at night because of this. We're going to lose them. That's my concern. So I agree. A partnership is absolutely imperative. We have to work together. I am completely dedicated, as worthless as I am as a Republican, but I am completely dedicated to working with the department and anyone who feels compelled to ensure that our state's youth and families organization is top notch. And that's really where I want us to be. So I ask for bluntness when you speak to this committee and when you speak to folks in general about what it is you need so that we can best implement those things, because we have to get out of this bog that we've been in, frankly, since the 70s that I'm aware of, where we are not keeping up with par. So I again put out the invitation for that. I also put out my praise for the department, the folks that are working so hard, but also we cannot continue to just fluff this off. We have to act now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rep. Chippendale. I have a follow-up question based on what Rep. Chippendale just stated. Have we increased salaries for our frontline workers over the years, and how do we compare to Massachusetts and Connecticut with salaries and with caseloads?
I know that the collective bargaining agreements were updated during the Governor Raimondo administration during her first term, and they are currently up for renegotiation. That process just starting, was delayed because of the pandemic. So the salaries have increased by way of the contract negotiations from the last cycle, and we'll see what happens during the current contract negotiations. We would have to do the comparison. I don't have that off the top of my head comparison, but we can certainly seek to get a comparison between our wages and the wages that are paid to frontline, let's say, frontline staff, frontline supervisors in Massachusetts. I think that'd be a good comparison.
Thank you. Do any other committee members have questions of Director O'Coin? Anybody? Okay, I'm going to turn it over then to Jennifer Griffith, our child advocate, for an update from her as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Casemiro, to the rest of the committee. To those of you who you have not had the pleasure of meeting yet, I am Jennifer Griffith, the child advocate for the state of Rhode Island. To explain what that means and who I work for and what we do at my office, I'd just like to be clear that we run an independent state agency. I do not work for the court, I do not work for the State House, and I do not work for DCYF. There are 9 of us. We presently have 8 FTEs filled. We are hoping to fill a 9th position. With the 8 of us, we oversee all of the children who are in state care. We review all of the group homes, the training school, any medical or specialized facility where a child is placed. We can intervene in any court case. And the last few months, we are adding from each judge about 4 to 5 court cases a week that we are now getting involved in, whether it's been TPRs that are taking too long, lack of proper education planning in certain cases, lack of housing, a variety of issues. And we are involved in our guardian ad litem cases for the young people who are developmentally disabled. We also are responsible, if many of you recall, for the reviews when there's a fatality or near fatality in state care, and we've written 3 of those in the last 5 years. I do have several comments just to respond to some of the things that Director O'Coin has said, and always open to answering your questions. I'll start with the update on the director. I do want to state that I have had the best professional working relationship with Kevin O'Quine that I did not enjoy or did not have at all with the last two. I just want to be very clear about that. Kevin and I, this is the first time we've gone till 5 o'clock, not seeing each other in some Zoom or Teams meeting. We talk all the time on the phone, at night, on the weekend. I'm always in communication with him. I thank him, even though sometimes we certainly do disagree about how we think things should go. He has invited me or a member of my staff to be at almost every single venue that he is at or any meeting, and I thank him for that. That is a definite departure from the past. We still have our arguments, but they are civil in their nature. I will lead with that. About the director, I am part of the committee. We have had interviewed 2 people last year, but I am pleased to know, in speaking with Secretary Jones, that the governor anticipates looking for candidates. I would always suggest that there could be candidates for this job within the department presently, not to be offensive to any outside candidate, but I do think we should always look within the agency to see who has experience and knowledge of what we do here in Rhode Island. About the caseloads, I took some notes as Kevin was speaking, which I guess is the benefit to going second at these things. And although I appreciate his position that in his 38 years, they have never been at a caseload lower than 15, I would say, why don't we make 2021 the year in which we lower them? Just because we have always had them at 15 does not certainly mean that we can't aspire to 12. Out of respect for the people who work at DCYF, which I have a great continuing respect for the frontline workers and most administrators, I want to be clear. When I hear 15 cases, I don't want anyone in the group or listening to me to think that that means 15 people. That means 15 families with, could you have 1 child? You could have 10 children. And the issues that children present in our child welfare system are significant and vast. They are not, imagine if you were responsible yourself, let's just make a round number of 4, because 15 times 4 I know the answer to, it's 60. To be responsible for 60 young people with a variety of issues, with many different schools, many different mental health challenges, different placements, different foster homes, that's a lot for a social worker to have to coordinate each and every week. So I want to be clear, is 15 better than we've had it before? Yes, but I'd like to suggest, why don't we try to get it lower? Let's get it to 12, let's get it to 13. I'm not saying I ever was a social worker. I was a legal services attorney, which is quite different, but along the same vein. I will tell you, for them to have to lower their commitment of families from 15 to 12, that by lowering it 2 or 3 families would be very significant for these social workers to lower perhaps their caseload by, how many children, 10 to 15%. Please keep that in mind, because these children have so many needs and they need to be taken care of. So again, I'd like to still, lower the caseloads. I think it's important also to note in the accreditation notes on the slides that DCYF has provided, $10 million for all the hearings we've been at, for all the money we've spent on this federal lawsuit. I would suggest that $10 million is worth the investment for our children and their families. And if the Council on Accreditation is suggesting that they would need 90 frontline workers additionally to seek this accreditation, maybe we should listen to that. 90 is a lot more than the 12, respectfully, that Kevin is mentioning, and that is in the governor's budget. I think more than 12 is needed. And now, would I love to have 90? That'd be great. But I would just like to have you keep in mind, the accreditation people are saying they would need 90 more to meet this accreditation, not 12. For calls to the hotline, yes, nationally and locally, we follow the national trends of calls being lowered. But I would like to acknowledge Administrator Terry, who did include me and my office on all of the outreach to schools, and I thank her for that. Again, there's a difference between administrators trying to include us on positive things we can do for children. My office and their office does not have to be in constant combat. Although you'll know in the next sentence, I will note, I am not afraid to be in combat with DCYF either. But I want to be clear, they included us on all the Providence meetings, Woonsocket, Central Falls, Pawtucket, and that I am thankful. We still have an ongoing meeting every Tuesday at 2 where we meet with the administrators to make sure they have the right numbers, they know who to call. In my office, I do want to thank our public information outreach person, Cara Foley, who was not able to be here tonight, but she continued to do significant amounts of outreach with school departments across the state, police departments, and other community agencies. As it goes for retaining and recruitment of staff, I am pleased to see the chart about the last 2 years and the last 1 year. But frankly, I am less interested in those, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to those who have joined DCYF in the last year or two, but I am more interested in learning about retaining those who have been there 5 years, 10 years, 25 years. I would like to know those numbers to say, what is it that makes someone who's been, a career at DCYF for 20 years, what makes them say, this is where I've had enough? What keeps them there, or what prevents them, from staying an entire career there? There are many people who have been at DCYF. I can think of numerous people who have spent their entire career there, but I know how much they struggle. I know how this work affects them, and I just think it should be taken into account how many people leave after the 2-year period. How many classes, if you were in a class from 15 years ago, how many of you are still there, and how many of you have left to go to other agencies, still interested in being a good helper, a good social worker, a good citizen, but they just don't want to do it at DCYF anymore. So I want to retain those we have. I'd like to retain the first and second year, I want to call them students, but first and second year members, but more interested and more focused on those who have been in their career instead of bouncing out to another agency or go privately. However, about the settlement, this is where I will have an example of a slight disagreement that I have just in the way that it was presented by DCYF. And I think Kevin knows me well enough to know that I would say this. The lawsuit was brought by 2 child advocates ago, Jametta Alston. And just to be clear to the committee, the reason the lawsuit was brought, it kind of matches up in instances with the benchmarks that you see on the chart. So for example, that there were not enough vetted foster homes, that the caseload standards were too high. And again, in each of my death reviews, the first recommendation that we made in all 3 reports, 2 of which were in 2017, and 1 was in June 2019, each one leads with increase the number of frontline workers to make the caseloads more manageable. I still stand by that now. But in the lawsuit in 2006, the premise was the caseload standards are too high. We have to lower them. The investigations to CPS were taking too long then. There were too many unlicensed foster homes. Siblings were separated for visits, and siblings were separated when removed from a home. We still talk about these topics now. It's unfortunate it took as long as it did, but these lawsuits do go on for a very long time. They're not designed when they settle to be resolved in 2 to 3 years. I want them to get out of all these benchmarks, I assure you. But it's a process, and respectfully, they are out of 3 of these benchmarks. They are not out of the other 9. Now, in one of the charts, I think it was on page 8, there were some green highlighted sections, which could be kind of confusing or respectfully misleading because they show numbers that are at the level of compliance or higher. I just want to be clear. And I do want to acknowledge again, they are very close to achieving 6.2 caseworker visits. They are very close to achieving the benchmark in non-kinship homes without a license. And again, in CPS, they are very, very close to the benchmarks in CPS reports being screened in their response time. The answer to explain how I got involved is this. The lawsuit was brought by 2 child advocates ago, and then the last child advocate who I replaced chose to come out of the lawsuit, and children's rights joined in. So I am not a party to the lawsuit or my office any longer. When I received this job in 2016, I was informed by the governor that I would be taking on the additional role of being the federal monitor. I want to be clear and thank the then legislative body and Speaker Mattiello, who gave me an additional position, which I would never have been able to do this work without this additional person. The lawsuit is the reason we have not let them out of those benchmarks is that we are having arguments over the sample size and validity of how many cases are being analyzed. So I want them to get out of these, but I just want to be clear, until we either mediate those disputes, have meetings about them, or go to federal court to have a trial over them, I am not signing off on these benchmarks because they haven't met what we feel to be sample size valid groups. That is my non-statistical answer, but the bottom line is they are close, but we are not accepting them as out of them. So they're out of 3. They're close on several, and several they need to do a lot of work on, just to be clear. I also do want to mention that with these individual children had people bring these lawsuits on their behalf. So for example, children who were physically or sexually assaulted in placements or not having enough of the placement array, which respectfully is still an issue we have now with not having enough placements to put children into. I also do want to be clear that, some of the issues that we deal in the lawsuit, and I think Vice Chair Casemiro asked of Kevin, is this something that you plan on, following? I assure you that we'll still be following them because these are basic tenets of child welfare, where people are visiting, where they are placed, and it's something certainly that there were a lot of areas to improve that many states would have. But I just do want to acknowledge they're only out of 3, hopefully soon more, but not until we agree that the sample size has been met in a validity standpoint. Other than that, Vice Chair, those are the comments on that. I'm happy to answer any questions about what we see for trends or any other issues, but those are my answers in response to Mr. O'Coin's presentation.
Thank you.
I was born in
Thank you.
1996.
Thank you, Jennifer. We appreciate it. Does anybody have any questions of Jennifer? Representative Knight?
Hi, Jennifer. How are you?
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. Since it's the first time I'm talking, hello to everyone from DCYF and Director O'Coin. Thank you for your presentation today. Jennifer, do you, if you can, do you have a horizon when you think DCYF might come into compliance on everything in the lawsuit? And if not, I know we already talked about funds. What are the major obstacles besides that in achieving those goals?
Well, that's one blue book answer, Representative Knight. Question, I would say, Representative Knight. Do I think they can get out of these benchmarks? Yes. And I want to be clear, I want them to. I want them to succeed. And I think anyone who works there every day is, not saying, well, gee, I have to make sure I cross off my section 0.6.2 today. But these social workers are doing exactly what they're supposed to the best of their ability. And if you're kind of asking me, what do I think they need to get out of this? They need more people. And do I think some data could be off because a box didn't get checked? We all do that. We don't check the right box, or when you order Amazon, you collect the wrong box, it goes to the wrong place. I check the wrong box all the time, but I do not think that these social workers are checking the wrong box. They need to be able to say, I have less to do. They can be more proactive, and they can work with their families if they simply have fewer families to work with. And I don't mean to give such a simplistic answer, but again, we look historically, and I mention this all the time, and I don't give him a credit for this enough, but there's a former administrator at DCYF who has sat in each of the reviews that we have written. And every single time he mentions how when he left the department, there were 900 employees, and now we're at 617. I know a lot of people move, but we retained our congressional seats. We don't need to have a sweep of 300. And I think DCYF historically, at the end of the day, sometimes takes a budgetary hit that they do not need. They need more additional workers. So again, Kevin's advocating for 12. I'd like to double that for 25. And I just want to make sure that it's not the standard of workers, because we have a great standard. We have excellent people working there. Let's give them an excellent coworker to sit next to them to help them out. That is my best answer as how they can get out of this lawsuit expeditiously, but doing it as they need to.
Thank you for that. And I that's what I wanted to hear, because I think that's the right answer, at least from where I sit. It's not rocket science. DCYF has, and I'll piggyback onto Whip Chippendale's comments here. I mean, DCYF has had a variety of budgetary challenges, which has created problems, which then compound into other problems because it's a resource issue, and when you have an under-resourced agency, and you put too much of a load on the people who are there, then there's like all kinds of other problems that come out of that. I recognize that. So I asked that question because I thought that was the answer, and you're right, and I'm glad you said it. But everyone who's watching, everyone who's listening should see that DCYF needs to have a significant budget boost, and we should do it as soon as possible. Thank you for all your work.
And not to cut you up, Ref Knight, but this pandemic, I also want to acknowledge from the day, Kevin was the one who called me to say, Kevin was the one who called me to say in March, we're moving towards, it was he who let me know, just to be clear, that it was time to move operations to the home. And I thank him for that, because maybe we'd still be in Cranston after all this time. No one told us. But I want to acknowledge during this pandemic, this is a group of people who went to work every single day. No vaccine, hope the best for the PP. They went to work every day. They went to visit kids in the driveway, okay? They went to court. They were going to find kids who were missing. They didn't say, oh, gee, I'm going to stay home. They went to work. So not only that, I just find it so interesting and perhaps so troubling at the same time that we all see signs on social media when we drive places that, restaurants don't have enough people. Please be patient. We can't take as many diners. Why don't we for once direct that kind of same sympathy or empathy towards DCYF and say, they have to take in all the diners they get. They can't turn away kids at the door. They take the calls that they get. So let's accept that and say, just as your favorite restaurant might close on a Tuesday, DCYF doesn't get to do that. So let's bump up their budget to where they can actually do the best work. They do the best work they can. Let's make it easier for them to do that.
And I think she said it all, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Do you want to speak? No. Jennifer, you'll stand by, right, during the rest of this meeting?
Oh, of course. And I also should say, I don't know how I forgot to say, Caitlin Medeiros is with me as well, my assistant child advocate. If I falter on any settlement questions, she's always here for me at all times. So, of course, I'm here for the duration, Chair.
Hi, Caitlin. Nice to see you again, too. And I'm sorry, I don't know if you spoke, but I had to run downstairs to finance. But I appreciate your standing by, too. Before I ask my question, Chairwoman Williams, did you have a question? Did I see your hand up?
Yeah, but you can ask your question.
I missed the whole presentation, Director O'Coin, on staffing employees by category. And, I want to preface my comments with, Jennifer, I agree with you. I had occasion to contact Director O'Coin several times during the pandemic, and I have to say that he was responsive. He returned my call and or my email every single time. Like most of you, we were contacted by constituents with a whole variety of problems. So whenever I contacted Director O'Coin to look into something for me, for a constituent, he always did. Sometimes, as you say, it wasn't the answer I wanted, and it wasn't all the information I would have liked to have, but I understand that, and I accept that. But Director, I just want to preface my comments, letting you know, since this is the first time I speak to you, since we've been shut in, I want you to know how much I appreciate that, and I want to say it publicly. But I did miss the presentation on staffing. Administrators, I'm on page 10. Administrators is $7,324,000 and $335. So how many administrators is that, Director? Do you have a number?
Actually, we did have an answer, and Adam Williams helped me out on this. It represents, in that pie chart to the left, that pie chart reflects a breakdown of the 586 staff that we currently have receiving a paycheck on April 30th. 7% of the 586 is approximately 40 administrators.
Now, when you say 40 administrators, do you include legal staff in that number?
No, because the legal staff is actually under the budget of the Executive Office of Health and Human Services.
Okay, so you don't have specific attorneys dedicated just to DCYF?
Not in our budget. I mean, although they're in the EOHHS budget, they actually work here at DCYF, but they're not technically in our budget.
And they're not in your budget. So in the budget that was presented by Governor Raimondo, and I assume amended by Governor McKee, I'm not on finance, did you have a hand in crafting that and in making those requests, or did that all come out of Buda and Secretary Jones?
As to the legal office, that would have come out of EOHHS. I must say, though, that as part of Governor McKee's budget, he did include 2 FTEs in the DCYF budget to fund 2 paralegal positions in our legal office, again, under the DCYF budget.
So what I'm hearing is that it's your frontline workers where you most feel the shortage. Is that correct?
Well, we went through that in the presentation.
I know, and I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. No, these are good questions. It gives me an opportunity to reinforce. So it's important to understand that under the FY21, the skinny budget in FY21, we had FTEs of 617.5, and on the April 30th payroll, 586 of our staff received a check. At that time, there were 14 staff on long-term leave who were not getting paid because they lent their long-term leave, and that then brings our total personnel roster up to 600. If you go to page 11 of the presentation, it outlines all of the vacancies that existed at DCYF as of April 30th. And what we did is, there's 18 on that page, which would be the difference between the 600 and the 617.5. Okay, all the ones that are in red, which are 14 and 18, the department has submitted a request to backfill those positions, and we are currently in the process of hiring and recruiting and hiring for those 14 positions. Of note is that when you look at that, I'm just eyeballing it, "11 of the frontline staff, 11 would be the frontline staff, social caseworkers, child protector investigators, casework supervisor, a clinical social worker, and a senior cook at the training school." Okay, we are in the process of recruiting and hiring for those positions. And then we have 2 support clerical positions that we are currently in the process of recruiting and hiring for, and 1 administrative position.
Now, when you include when you talk about the frontline positions, do you include the JPWs at the training school? They're included in this number?
That is correct. Great question. So you're aware when you look at the chart, because that's absolutely important to understand when you look at that. The frontline positions are social workers, child protector investigators, child support technicians. All frontline supervisors are included in our frontline position, as they frequently will have interaction directly with clients, families. We also include the frontline staff at the training school, nurses, juvenile program workers, clinical social workers, and our probation staff as well.
All right, and at the training school, how many administrators are there?
I believe it's 5.
5, and the population...
Hold on, if I could, I'm including juvenile probation, so it's the Division of Youth Development, which includes juvenile probation and the RITs. As to the RITs alone, the administration consists of the superintendent and an executive director of youth development. So the technically would be 2, but if you include, well, I should go beyond that. Then there's a principal, that's 3, and there's a chief of clinical services, 4. So for the training school, there are 4 administrators and 1 juvenile probation administrator.
And the population there, is at an all-time low, is that correct?
That is correct. They are currently at, as of today, 31 youth.
31 youth. And what's an
There's
all...
about 200 youth on juvenile probation, most of which are on community supervision.
Now, do you attribute that to the pandemic as well? Young people not being out in the streets and not being in the schools, getting into fights and...
I think there's a couple of factors, but certainly the pandemic is one of them. Keep in mind that if we did a chart showing the historical trend in terms of the youth and juvenile justice, you would see a consistent pattern of a decline in juvenile justice, both at the training school and juvenile probation, dating back to at least 2009. But there's no doubt that over the last 14, 18 months, there's been a significant drop in terms of our average population. We are starting to see it come up a little bit. As I said, we're at 31. We were in the teens a couple of months ago. And that consists of all youth at the training school. That's female youth, that's detained male youth, and adjudicated male youth. So the 31 is actually on the way up.
Now, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of this, but this is an all-time low, and you say there was, I forget your words, decline in juvenile, what were the words you used? Decline in
But
juvenile?
it's been an overall decline in juvenile justice population over the last, I'd say at least going back to 2009.
All right, juvenile justice population. Now, young people that go to the training school are sentenced by a judge or a magistrate, and usually those sentences are based upon recommendations by the social worker and the DCYF worker, correct, usually?
Not usually, no. A youth that ends up the training school, it's always as a result of the filing of a juvenile justice petition. Those filings are done for the Office of the Attorney General. The Office of the Attorney General assigns a prosecutor to these cases, and the Attorney General will go into court if they want to seek a hold, or if law enforcement, let's say local law enforcement or state police, ask for a hold. They can seek a immediate hold from a judge. Ultimately, the case will go before a family court judge or a magistrate, and the judge or magistrate can decide whether to issue the hold. Our social workers are generally not involved in that. We have no standing to be asking for an order of detention on a youth that's subject to a juvenile justice petition.
So if this trend began in, what did you say, 2018?
Well, actually, it's really started in 2009.
All right, 2009. So this is hypothetical on your part, but would you say that that's because our juveniles have just become very much more well-behaved since 2009? Do you think the AG and the state police have taken a much more liberal approach? So in practical terms, what do you attribute it to?
I think there's a number of factors. Number one, there's been a lot of emphasis on diversion. So, the literature will tell us that you will get better outcomes for youth if you can successfully divert the youth away from the juvenile justice system. Now, there's some offenses, and there's no doubt, there's always the legal standard of community safety. Okay, so if a youth is engaged in a behavior that puts himself and the community at risk, the court will, without hesitation, detain that youth. But on those cases where you don't have a direct and clear community safety issue, there's been a lot of emphasis with the court and with the department to identify community diversionary options. So the court's intake office has been very active in its diversionary programming, so that every youth that receives a juvenile offense is referred to the intake office, and they will screen whether or not that offense qualifies for diversion. Separate from that, even before it gets to the court's office, many city and towns, and particularly like Pawtucket, Central Falls, Providence has one. Almost every city and town has one, but some are more active than others. They have a juvenile hearing board component. And the city and town has the option of referring a youth who commits a minor offense to the juvenile hearing board, and if the youth and the family agree to use that process for diversion, they can successfully divert that youth away from going into the formal juvenile justice system. So between the diversionary programs at the front end for youth juvenile hearing boards and through the court's intake process, and I must say, the court's intake process, they have very impressive data in terms of how many youth have gone into that process and have been successfully diverted away from the juvenile justice system and have not come back to the juvenile justice system. So those are items that have really taken on some prominence over the last 5 years or longer. The other item I would say that's factoring into this is many cities, particularly Providence, has implemented its community policing model. And the community policing model in Providence has resulted in fewer formal arrests. So Providence has this thing called the GO team, where they have a service provider go out with the law enforcement, and they work with the family, they work with the youth, and if they can resolve the matter without going to filing a formal petition, they will. I was at a presentation probably about 3 years ago where Providence did a presentation on their criminal filings, both adult filings and juvenile filings. it was pretty impressive to see the reduction in both their adult filings and juvenile filings based on this community policing model. Let me be clear, I have a lot of respect for Chief Clemens and the Providence Police Department. When community danger is out there, they will take the appropriate action. But they're handling the cases that don't meet the community safety threshold in a way that's different than what they used to handle. So we're seeing less cases coming in from cities like Providence. I believe Pawtucket is also developing a very similar model as well.
So, and these organizations exist within, or groups or specialties exist within the police departments themselves?
Providence themselves actually has a contract with, I think it's Family Services of Rhode Island, to operate this GO team where they actually go out with the law enforcement in response to some calls.
I believe we have one in West Warwick as well. So
they're very effective, very, very effective. And I'm not saying it, we're not involved in the contract, so we have no vested interest in this, but as having some experience in the juvenile justice system, that is absolutely best practice.
Okay, and I don't want to spend the whole rest of the meeting on this because we do have about 1, 2, 3, 4,